So I'm going to start. I thank you, Jameson, for accepting the invitation. This is the last meeting from our reading group on the littoral between psychoanalysis and cinema. I wrote a 5 minutes intro. I'm going to show 2 images and then I give you the floor to talk. So I'm going to start. Can we forget how to breathe? What happens when we forget how to breathe? Unconscious breathing. We will soon hear Jamieson Webster's talk about breathing and the unconscious. And today, we also celebrate this littoral between psychoanalysis and cinema. This is strand of land we reach by breathing and swimming, where we are building knowledge and transversing important concepts that have to do with the practice of talking and listening. Concepts of desire, libido, drive, lamella, fiction, or the Lacrimae Rerum, real, symbolic, imaginary, for instance. And then I'm going to share my screen with you just to show 2 images. Can you guys see the images here?
Mm-hmm.
So we have the boxes playing music and the flames from the candles. A flame closer to a speaker makes forms. Candles placed in front of subwoofers have their flames dancing to music. This is what Vivian Kakuri, the artist, relays in her work, Oratorio, Tidal Wave. It's a double name. It's Oratorio and Tidal Wave from 2016. Oratorio, Tidal Wave, is a space where dancing forms are praying, talking, and being oral, where water produces waves caused by gravity, by interactions occurring between the sun, the moon, and the earth. When analyzing the movement of flames because of speech, Theodor Schwenk, in the book Sensitive Chaos, asks, and then I'm quoting him, doesn't nature here point to speech as the source of all its great abundance of forms? Schwenk's question, putting human speech in nature, complicates the assurance that language is a binary representation of what is culture and what is not. Talking is writing with air in the same way that filming is both inscribing and transposing times by recording movements and forms. Light reaches objects, bodies, landscapes, and drawings, writing them on the surface of the film and also on the codings of the digital. How do we call this visible invisibility? Death image? That's a question and a hypothesis. To film with the ear, to film the air that moves from one person to another, from one's mouth to one's own and someone else's ear holes. Air in movement is wind, crossing, passing between bared subjects and objects. Subjects are bared by language. Subjects are bared by language. Language, the big other, is a space. The forms we may be able to work with in psychoanalysis are the formations of the bared other, that is the unconscious. Dreams, for instance. Is the wind caused by this moving object A the clinic tries to summon? Air in movement, wind makes energy. Air is fuel, as the sexualized libido fuels the drives, investing and covering other objects. Object A is a source of energy for desire to have roots and to rhizomatically produce more desire. The image I am trying to elaborate on is of the underground in relation to the sky. Desire is a practice of the analysant and possibility of emancipation. Underground processes affect the sky, and sky processes affect the underground. We analyze and film under those circumstances. Thomas Lamar proposes in his book, The Anime Machine, that animation is an art of wind, and then I quote him. Unlike oil, coal, gas, uranium, the wind is not only abundant, but also ungraspable. The wind cannot be possessed or entirely territorialized, yet it sustains a relation to Earth. Moving images of animation alert us to the sky above our heads and to underground design routes, to the air that weighs, and to pressure that cuts across gaps, intervals, and planes. I recall The Fallen Sky, Davi Kopenawa's book, The Yanomami Shaman, talking about a cosmos to Bruce Albert. For us here today, in this meeting, breathing is a means of living. The air is a meanwhile, a time of inhaling and exhaling, of life and death. Our dealings with this planet as earthlings are organized and disorganized by the air. The movements of our bodies, machines, forms, and plasticities of our bodies' breath. I'm just gonna finish with this last paragraph. I go to another shaman. Is Sigmund Freud underlining the relations between earth and sky when he covers the analysant's couch with a rug? Usually you step on rugs that are on the floor, but Freud makes the rug a piece for the whole body, not only for the feet. A piece for the analysant to lie down and talk. To lie down on his study's couch is to lie down on the ground, facing not the analyst, but the ceiling, the rug where a child plays at a grandparent's house. A scene from analysis. So I'm gonna finish sharing. And Jameson, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Lucas has been enormously helpful, sending me great quotes on breathing as we prepared for the meeting today. So thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's difficult for me in a way to do this because I'm in the middle of the project on breathing. I'm like 175 pages deep, and I should be done by now, but I'm only halfway through what I planned. And I'm in the worst part of the book. I'm in the darkest part of the book, which I've been telling one of my research assistants is here, Stacy, that I just I can't move through it. I'm writing about fentanyl. I'm writing about Sloterdijk's book, Terror from the Air and Gas Warfare. He kind of has this moment in which the first chlorine gas weapon was used in World War I, and then it's the beginning of the gas chamber, and then it's the beginning of, for him, control over the air, and what he calls a process of taking what was a background given and explicating it into the outside where it's an object of control and human design that's always sort of militaristic. And I'm going to begin today with a primal scene around COVID and fentanyl, but this is like the background material of it. And it's pretty bleak. And as we watch the war unfolding today, it just sort of hits me over and over again. And so I can't write myself out of it, as it seems to be happening all around you. And of course, the question of climate change is also huge. But to begin, I decided to show just a scene. I was going to show a compilation of images from Todd Haynes' movie Safe. But I'm just going to show a scene from it. The compilation was interesting just because it shows the various instances in which he shows difficulty breathing and anxiety around it. And there's a quote from him where he says that he wanted to make a movie in which all of the air felt recycled. But I wanted to kind of zero in on the scene with Julianne Moore at the baby's, at a baby shower, actually. And because it's just kind of amazing. This is the compilation that we're not going to look at. All right, hold on. Let me share my screen. You can see my messy desktop. Wait, why can't I move things around? Hold on. Okay.
Love that little bunny.
Everyone can hear it? Yeah.
Oh, she got so glad. I don't know that it's perfect. You need to take it back, please. I won't be offended. It's from Neiman Marcus. Oh no, I really love it. It's perfect.
So sweet. You should see my baby book. It's this disgusting sort of puke orange.
Barbara,
I'm serious.
Hey, Lynn, my turn. Linda, thank you. I hope you like it. Oh, so pretty. Did you wrap that yourself? God, are you kidding? I wish I were that creative. Well, I can you wrap them.
Oh, I can't even draw a straight line.
Okay, hands up. Who wants decaf? You heard it was
Herbal tea,
exciting. Oh yeah, we're really happy. Gary,
real coffee.
he must be so happy. Yeah, it's more like this is so great. Oh, God.
John. There's a problem of the entrance hall.
Hey, come to Elise. I don't know what you did wrong now. You have to let mommy have some grown-up time with the other mommies, okay? You know, someone told me they heard she was doing her drink or something, so I just thought you might have. No, I didn't even know. Is something wrong with Cheryl? No, you were just. Her skin looks kind of. I mean, her hair looks really cute, but Elise, your ice cream is melting and mommy is very busy. Did you get some? No. You want some? No. You sure? Carol, this is yours. You have to eat it immediately because it's melting all over. Gosh. What do you got there, honey? My coloring book. Can I see? Oh, it's gotten so big. Barbara, this is delicious. You know, we haven't really talked lately. How you doing? Good. We've just been a little. Look at it, you. Yeah. Under the weather, right? Look at it. She's a princess. Oh, that's very good. It's very realistic.
Ladies, we are now opening the big present. Please come in.
Hi. Here we come. Well, Elise, let's go. Look at the big present.
No, it's a different one.
You thought he was?
Yeah, have you seen, what did you see it? God, I haven't seen it.
Oh, you have to. Down to the black. He thinks it's too much.
Come on, don't be polite.
Oh, I'm totally.
There's a package of the wheels inside, and then the other one really is just sort of giving you. That's where it was in a while. Well, Carol, but you're right. Yeah, thank you. Carol, what's going on? I don't know. Carol? Oh my God, Linda, what happened? She can't breathe. Carly, call her house. Someone should call her doctor. And Jennifer, could you get some water, please? Let's try to relax, okay?
Right, that's the scene from Safe. Many of the elements I'm going to talk about today are there in an important way because the question of breathing always returns to a question of anxiety in Freud. And, you know, a lot of treatments today are often aimed at, you know, these sort of measures to help people breathe again. You have a lot of Eastern philosophies making their way into therapeutic techniques. You have I don't know, the wellnessification of life aimed to treat people's anxiety, but there's something about anxiety that's important as a primal scene in psychoanalysis. And Stacy and I have done all this work, and it turns out that many of Freud's early followers, especially the ones that were rejected by him, wanted to ask a question about anxiety and breath. And even people who you don't think of. So for example, Breuer was a pulmonologist before he started working in the psychological field. Fliess had his whole theory of the nose and the cycles of the nose, which are about kind of breathing cycles that the nose goes through. And he thought that this was signs of the bisexuality of the human being, and Freud let him do all the nasal surgeries on his patients and including on Freud himself to cure depression, which, you know, was a complete fallacy, but nevertheless it's there. You have Otto Rank, who elevated the concept of birth trauma in his theory of psychoanalysis, and which caused a breakdown between his relationship with Freud. You have Sander Ferenczi, who was using Rank and Freud's work on the beyond the pleasure principle to reconstruct a kind of phylogenetic inheritance of man going back from the moment that we went from the sea to the land, in which Ferenczi thought that the land and the question of sexual differentiation on land was a catastrophe for man, that it meant a life of friction and pain. You have Wilhelm Reich, very famously, obviously, who worked not just on the body and breathing, but whose theories of kind of somatic liberation, which would be breathing liberation and bodily tension liberation, would lead to a kind of sexual revolution that would cure fascism and apparently also control the weather. There's an amazing quote by James Baldwin, who said, at this point in time, when everyone was in their orgone boxes trying to, you know, control their orgone energy, that people had plenty of orgasms, but they still sliced each other with razors on Saturday. And I have no hope for this liberation ethos of man and breathing. You have Jung also, who did work on breathing. So you have this kind of amazing primal scene, and I think Freud's answer is different, which is what I want to talk with you about today. But I love this movie. I also love something about when she's looking in the mirror and she can't get a grip on her self-image, and then it's the door, right? And then she walks through the door and it closes and she's about to go into her asthmatic attack. And you have the child who's being impugned against by all the adults. They have these horrible voices towards the child, like, eat your cake, it's belting. You know, it's just like these horrible superegoic commands. And she says to Carol, it's you. Right. And so both of them trying to establish this question of a self-image, and then they're the ones in the scene of the collapse of breath. And the mirror scene with Carol looking in the mirror in the bathroom mirrors the very end of the movie that I love and is incredibly haunting. When Carol joins a cult, she leaves the, her sort of horrible white bourgeois suburban life, and she joins a cult that says that they're going to cure all of her breathing symptoms. And it's basically like further and further isolation from whatever, the world and the community. And like they have these mantras that, you love yourself, we are as one, we can breathe free, we know what the world is doing to our bodies, together we will heal ourselves. And at a certain moment when it's her birthday celebration and she's going to speak to what she's learned from the cult, she has nothing to say for herself anymore. Her speech turns into these almost psychotic fragments of repeating what the cult says. And she goes back to her igloo and she just repeats, I love myself, as she looks in the mirror, and her face is looking more and more and more ill. And that's the end of the movie. So you'll see how this comes back today in my talk. So forgive me, but I'm going to jump around in my material, and then we can have a discussion. And if I miss anything, I can hopefully fill it out for you. All right, so I want to start with a primal scene fever dream about fentanyl and breathing that begins with the pandemic. I was writing a story that began with staring at the word fentanyl in green lights on the intubation machines of my patients in a coma during the first wave of COVID. I was working as a palliative care psychoanalyst, and I often found myself trying to relax in the intensive care unit away from the frenzy of the hospital. It was nighttime. I listened to the sound of all those bodies being breathed by machines, most of whom wouldn't survive. A macabre joke started to sink in that wouldn't stop, like an interminable knock-knock joke. Who's there? Fentanyl. Fentanyl who? How is the painkiller used for medical comas to save the lives of people who can't breathe also the leading cause of overdose deaths in the United States? The people who can't breathe are taking fentanyl to stop breathing so the machine can breathe for them while their lungs heal from the ravaging effects of coronavirus. And the people who use fentanyl stop breathing and don't have the machine to keep their lungs going, which are perfectly healthy. The joke gets worse. Suicide rates would jump after the pandemic for the ages of those 10 to 24, nearly 54%, and asphyxiation was increasingly the means used by women, children, and minorities. Even worse, a fent is a slit in fabric, a breathing hole, close to vent, and the word appears to already mean to stop breathing, fentanyl. Fent is also a piece of waste fabric, a remnant. In 2022, fentanyl was responsible for 200 deaths every day, and over 250,000 Americans have died from a fentanyl overdose since 2018. In 2022, 73,000 people died from fentanyl, of the 110,000 overdose deaths that were reported. It's like 67%. Most of these deaths took place outside the hospital due to the inability to get adequate medical attention in time because fentanyl works fast. It's said to be 100 times stronger than morphine. It's also cheap and synthetic. I've stared at the ads on the subway asking everyone to carry naloxone, the opioid antidote that can reverse an overdose in the form of a one-time nasal spray. There are also ads showing pills or bags of drugs asking if you can tell which one has a deadly dose of fentanyl. We can't tell either. Or the ad showing a push pin with a minuscule amount of white powder on the head of the needle. This is enough to kill you. Colleagues who work with the homeless have told me that they are taught to rub their knuckles on a person's chest to see if they are slipping into a coma. Does it check their breathing? I asked. No, she said, I think it just hurts. Knuckle was the word a woman used to describe her clitoris after taking SSRIs for a decade in a recent article in the New York Times on a claim that many patients have been making that they never recover from the sexual numbness that followed their use of depression medications, even after stopping. The psychiatrist in the article insists that they're just depressed from not taking their meds. So they would be numb with or without them. Depression is obviously a cause for suicide, but so is chronic sexual dysfunction, and depression, so the psychiatrists claim, apparently causes sexual dysfunction, but then so does its cure. What an impossible explanatory loop with no exit from sedation. What pain medication seems to do that then SSRIs can't do is to give you relief from pain with pleasure, not without it. This brought me back to the primal scene of psychoanalysis. 3 events rocked Freud's world in the early period when he was beginning to mint his science. A friend who was a doctor and scientist was addicted to morphine used for pain from an amputated thumb. He then took cocaine at Freud's urging, but instead of curing his addiction to morphine, he began injecting both. Freud quit his investigations into cocaine as a result and missed out on being the cause célèbre in its discovery of its anesthetic properties. The friend eventually died from overdose. Then there was the death by suicide of a patient of Freud's whose psychogenic impotence he couldn't cure. And finally, Freud allowed his mentor, Wilhelm Reich, to perform nasal surgeries on his patient to cure her depression, and he almost killed her. Freud analyzed his guilt relentlessly, asking himself about his responsibility as a doctor, questioning his belief in a doctor's power over life and death. He began to isolate his desire against the scientists and medical practitioners he had long admired. His question had to be about psychic suffering. Psychoanalysis needed to separate itself from this fantastical intrusion into the patient's body, whether medically right or wrong, and concern itself with what it means to be a sexual and speaking being. Freud would exit any alliance with pharma, sedation, surgery, but also while refusing to accept forms of sexual anesthesia. Only then did he start to write his book on dreams. I thought about Freud. I thought about this primal scene of psychoanalysis as I tried to get out of this scene of death and suicide and sedation and asphyxiation. I heard the opening song from Sesame Street. Do you guys know it? Sunny day, sweeping the clouds away, on my way to where the air is sweet. Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street? For those who grew up on Sesame Street, its opening song is a gateway to the atmospheric memory of being a small child. Small, as if to follow the song's subtle alliteration and the sound of those drawn-out S's, sunny, sweet, sweeping, sweet, Sesame Street. Sesame Street was the utopian creation of Joan Gans Cooney and Lloyd Morrisett in 1969. I first watched the show in the early 80s and then again with my daughter not long after working in palliative care during COVID. 40 years on, the air is no longer promised as a neutral, nourishing environment. It carries and circulates the plague. It has been contaminated and made toxic by modern industrial civilization. In the contemporary imagination, sweet has been taken over by images of sickness, of scarcity, of suffocation, and of smothering. The snake eats its tail. The climate crisis means not being able at some point to breathe, whether the image is one of smoke, excess water, toxic air, unbearable temperatures, or simply the cessation of breath that is death. Thinking about this can induce panic, whose main symptom is hyperventilation, and then we can't breathe, imagining that we can't breathe. Freud believed that our first memories are centered on the sound of our own crying. Our cries are indelibly etched into our minds alongside whatever experiences of pain and fear, as well as the soothing of others that hopefully follows. All memories, he says, have an acoustic accompaniment that goes back to these first ones. It's a kind of double archive in the mind. Freud uses the German word schreien, which means crying out, bawling, wailing, screeching, yelling, but in the standard edition is translated as screaming. We are, in the Freudian universe, utterly helpless as human infants. And yet the infant has this power to solicit with their cries. The modulation of breath into a cry is a tool of survival that is also the beginning of memory, one that stretches all the way back to the beginning of the species, maybe even life. Eventually, our memories of crying develop into the wish to communicate and then the ability to do so. Through language, we are more able to get the help we need, though we only master this skill after we most needed it. This is the strange fact of being human, this prolonged helplessness and this disjunction between need and the acquisition of skills. Freud links the development of memory and language to crying, but he also links the organization of the mind to pleasure. The pleasures of the mouth are first, Freud's oral stage. The psychologist Renee Spitz said that the baby sees with its mouth. You can inhale everything with your mouth. This isn't just a literal definition of what it means to breathe. Everything that leans on breathing in the Freudian world of the child brings pleasure: eating, drinking, sucking, tasting, smelling, and yes, babbling, yelling, singing, and even screaming. The power of an infant's suck is magnificent. Feeling it on your nipple or finger is like a first taste of an inborn life force that seems to expand forever outward. This is where we have to first meet our infants. This world of pleasure balances the scales of so much helplessness. Infant means the one who cannot speak for themselves yet, but who can use their breath in all sorts of miraculous ways. It would be interesting to discuss the relative importance of the control of bronchus as an organ, wrote the pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott in 1941. At the Paddington Green Children's Hospital, where he worked for 20 years, Winnicott created a method for observing caregivers with their babies. In that essay, he turns to the case of a 7-month-old who had been suffering from bouts of asthma, as did her mother as a child and during pregnancy. He was able to observe one such attack and wrote of it, quote, the breathing out might have been felt by the baby to be dangerous if linked to a dangerous idea. For instance, the idea of reaching in to take. It will be seen that the notion of dangerous breath or of a dangerous breathing or of a dangerous breathing organ leads us once more to the infant's fantasies. Asthma, Winnicott says, is an involuntary control of expiration, a difficulty in letting go of one's breath, or from another angle, an excessive holding of breath. This is important because asthma is often, it's seen as the inability to take in, right? I mean, that's the feeling of it, like you saw with Julianne Moore, but it's actually the failure to exhale. And Winnicott says that it can only be a fantasy of imagined repercussions, right? Repercussions coming from the adult world that would stop the baby from surrendering to its natural impulse to exhale. Where natural inclinations are brought to a halt unnecessarily, symptoms erupt. Fortunately, this kind of inhibition in infants, in contrast to that in adults, can be reversed quite quickly by allowing the wish to carry on in its merry way. So this was amazing about Winnicott's experiment, is that he showed that if the impulse could kind of restart itself and go towards what it wanted to go to, rather than stop itself, that the asthma or the spasm of breath would go away. And the baby was open, like that the loop was really open to being rejiggered, like almost off the bat. But there had to be an intervention. We often forget that the fetus breathes using the placenta, so caught are we in the image of the baby like a fish swimming and breathing underwater. The best divers know how to conserve their oxygen in order to stay underwater longer and barely use their extremities for momentum. They just use breath. The average person can hold their breath somewhere between 30 and 90 seconds, but if 100% oxygen is breathed, the world record is 24 minutes and 38 seconds of breath holding. So breathing might seem natural, a kind of unconscious function taking place beyond consciousness, but it can be controlled in quite an extreme fashion, and is certainly available for involvement in neurotic symptoms or in the psychoanalyst's help. In fact, many of the first patients in psychoanalysis experienced choking symptoms, difficulty swallowing, feelings of suffocation, small tick-like coughs that Freud called tussis nervosus. And while many think of the paralytic limbs and emotional or epileptic fits when they picture Freudian hysteria, there really is a background of symptoms around breathing. Freud gave an example of what we might call respiratory erogeneity in 1895. Quote, a woman suffered from attacks of obsessional breathing and speculating, and the theme of her worry was always part or function of her body, for example, respiration. Why must I breathe? Suppose I didn't want to breathe, etc. One might also put Freud's relentless cigar smoking as one of the first psychoanalytic symptoms around breathing. The record holder for breath holding certainly shows us that the ability to breathe underwater is a learned skill. Studies suggest that what these people are doing is tapping into an evolutionary reflex, so that triggering involuntary breath, we tap into an aquatic life from billions of years ago. This follows Ferenczi's book, Thalassa, A Theory of Genitality, where he saw leaving the sea and crawling onto land to breathe air again and engage in sex reproduction as a catastrophe still present in our mental life. Maybe it wasn't about not wanting to breathe, but a wish to return to the sea, Ferenczi speculates. The sea for Ferenczi was an all-encompassing, nourishing, fluid environment where we were bisexual or transsexual, and fertilization took place outside in a watery expanse. Once on land, the wish to go home takes the form of semen, the little fish returning to the womb, and the sea is introjected inside in the form of amniotic fluid. Our crashing upon the shore is repeated in the shock of birth. Sexuality for Ferenczi is a regression to our primeval history as both oceanic bliss and the survival of the threat of desiccation during prior moments of climate catastrophe. I mean, it's a really crazy idea. It's kind of amazing, but he says that basically in sexuality, you both long for an oceanic bliss, but end up surviving the catastrophe of the drying up of the seas in surviving the sexual act. I mean, on top of it, he puts in there like domination of one half of the species by the other, and basically all sexuality is rape. I mean, he really goes wild. And then every time we have sex, we like live both sides of this, whatever, phylogenetic history. Ferenczi says that genitalia and reproductive organs differentiate and evolve on land, since air, unlike water, is unable to carry and mix gametes. The mixing becomes a property both internal to and between bodies, right? So in the water, it's all mixing in the water, and like sexuality is all mixed up. And then on land, we have these differentiated bodies that have to mix with each other. And this is basically what he calls sexual warfare. So Ferenczi is saying that the death drive is present in our extreme individuation, especially the forced domination of one half of the species on the other and the invention of patriarchy. Human sexuality develops as a process of friction and penetration. And he sees this as an evolutionary aberration where breathing and human sexuality are vulnerable bodily sites that will one day be subject again to threat. I mean, are we there? We might be there. I find the philosophy theory so moving. We want to go back to the ocean. We want a life of less friction, this bumping of bodies against one another, private property, acquisition of land, the war between the sexes. Isn't so much of what is taking place today an attempt to return to a more fluid sexuality, to undo or at least reckon with the violence and catastrophe that has resulted from human life on land? This catastrophe for Ferenczi is the beginning of anxiety, and so it surely makes sense that one of the few examples of mastering anxiety is ability to hold one's breath underwater again. But this is important because there's a big difference between Ferenczi and Freud. For Freud, the mastery isn't over breath, it's of symbolization. And this doesn't come up in Ferenczi. Freud wants to move away from this primordial origin point that Ferenczi and indeed Otto Rank or Wilhelm Reich were fixated on, as if a liberation of breath meant all kinds of other liberations, from land, from the maternal, from trauma, from the somatic, from domination. But what does the ability to symbolize have to do with breathing? Why is breathing right there at the place of what Freud is saying is the most fundamental somatic symbolic transformation? Well, Freud thought that defenses, in particular repression, push something out of awareness into the unconscious. When this happens, a symbolic representative of what was removed is created that is the beginning of a symbolic overlay in the psyche as an unconscious image of the body first, and then signification that follows. It's also a decisive separation from something too real, which always affects the body. So if repression was functioning, it was because it leaned on a more archaic repression, what Freud called primal repression. Repression was merely a false bottom under which there was an even greater unknown, which Freud said we should stop trying to know. The place where we encountered this false bottom he called the navel, as if the greater unknown was the maternal body. But this beyond attracted the psychoanalyst passion to no end. This is what Freud began to label with respect to his disciples as heresy. Freud steered clear of this terrain. He said it was all too mystical for him. He was more curious about the fact that on top of this repression lies a whole world of desire and its symbolic network. Events in one's life have multiple meanings. Desires emerge in relationship to one another, and they provide us with a sense of place, with a sense of time, and with a sense of space. This possibility was a whole new world separate from concrete needs or fears or bodily states, importantly putting distance between the child and pure life. He thought that those who wanted to raid this lockbox had a fantasy of immanence, of oneness. Pleasure and unpleasure, he say, exist in a relation to history that shapes our wishes, a field of repressed traumatic memories, and the formation of ideal images of what we would like to be or have. The French child psychoanalyst Françoise Dolto called this terrain symbologenic. She puts this transformation in mythic terms. Language, she says, is transmitted in a way that forbids anyone from devouring the other person, taking them over entirely. Language puts distance. This verbal prohibition is taken in along with language, saving both child and parent from anxiety by drawing a dividing line between them and extracting what she calls a pound of flesh. Freud, in fact, learned about this terrain from his hysterical patients. Freud called their inability to experience anxiety a beautiful indifference. And yet the paradox was that she would suddenly, in a moment of trauma, take off running headfirst to a scene that otherwise caused her no anxiety. There was a will to repeat some anxiety that she didn't know about that was repressed, but which saved her. Freud was fascinated by this, and he was fascinated by the work that analysis could do on this specific traumatic terrain, not in order to go further back behind it to all of the other repressions, but to push her forward. This also began to show him the importance of repression, and repression seemed to be a ground zero for the question of breathing. A large portion of anxiety should stay in repression with all the other things that are repressed. A hysteric might be emotionally labeled, but she's not anxious. What people seem to mean by hysteria in misogynistic layman's terms is that she is performative, dramatic, and manipulative. And this judgment is bound up with her capacity, however, to screen out anxiety, to put the anxious body that fails to breathe to bed by searching, in her sense, for what is ruthlessly possible or desired that she doesn't know that she wants. So this is really important, right? Because you have two different theories of psychoanalysis. You have a theory that wants to go back and search for the most primordial origins and cure something on the somatic side, which a lot of theories go to. And you have Freud saying, no, we have to go forward. We can't go back to an original unity. We have to see where the symptoms take us that show us the traumas that can be fixed now, the desires that can be awoken now, that will carry civilization forward. So repression is meant to save us from anxiety. Freud didn't want to dissolve the barrier. I think, in fact, he wanted to secure it or to resecure it, in fact. What is made conscious is never all, like the total annexation of foreign lands. And this would also be part of his difference, is that he doesn't want to make the unconscious conscious, which you start to hear a lot, even in the Ferenczi and the Rank, right? There's only a portion of it that can be made conscious. What is other, to put it in Lacanian terms, will always remain other, including, and this is my thesis, breath itself. And I think the otherness of breath is, in fact, speaking, which was pointed to by Lucas in his opening. So perhaps this return to breathing, I think actually in the atmosphere now, I mean, the COVID is coming up, climate change is coming up. The question of air in general and our treatment of air and the scarcity of air and the inequality of air is coming up. I think it shows us how little repression is functioning these days and how much we need it. And the idea is that in order for repression to function, this is what it means to have an unconscious in the strict sense. And if breathing is kind of taking over the scene in reality, then it might mean that we don't have an unconscious anymore, that it's too much on the outside. And I blame the internet. At the moment, I blame the internet for this. I'll stop there and I'll let us have a conversation. There's like 700 pages more than this, embarrassingly, but this is my hodgepodge for you guys today.
Thank you a lot, Jameson. Does anyone have a question or want to say something? No one? Just talk. Yeah.
I don't have a question per se, but I really appreciate your work, Jameson. I love the film Safe. It's one of my all-time favorites, and I think when I first saw it, I didn't really understand it, but it just captured me. I felt like it captured very much the world that I was in or that I was witnessing, but didn't really understand. And each time I watch it, and this time it was nice to just watch it together in this context. There's something about it that brings it all together. And then for me, I've also been working through asthma and the question of breathing through, especially the last few years. And I've tried all sorts. Like I felt like I really identify with the character Carol in that movie, going through all these different things and like with all the cultish elements, and especially with things like asthma and other translation issues. Like it's really like, is there a solution ever, or is it just learning how to live with the solution and maybe not even doing that, but just at least I appreciate the poetry. And sometimes there are these moments where things kind of go away for a bit. But yeah, that's what I want to say.
Yeah, I write a lot about my asthma, my son's asthma in the book. I cut it all out for today, but there's a big part of it, and asthma is an amazing symptom. I mean, all the analysts kind of like go back to it because it seems like such a wild thing to have interfered with, and physiologically, Stacey, you'll have to correct me here, but like, you know, on the realm of anatomy, physiology, asthma can't entirely be accounted for, you know, in both from the inside and from the outside. You know, like something neurotic has to get involved with it, you know, which is amazing. I mean, I like the confusion. You know, neither completely anatomical nor completely an irritating agent on the outside, but both, and the neurotic involvement in it as well. So it's very beautiful because it's like a knot that the psychoanalysts keep having to untie and retie and figure out what's taking place there.
I'll just add one quick thing is that for me, definitely psychoanalysis has helped me with regards to that. I'm not saying it's a cure-all, but the other thing that really has been something amazing for me was also I discovered free diving, as you have also mentioned, and I've never been much of a swimmer, and I had a lot of anxiety with that too. But with free diving, it was this whole thing about not breathing and to just really live with that, and it was one of the most liberatory experiences I've ever had. And turns out I'm a great free dive. I'm not great, but like going pretty quickly into it and having full asthma issues. In fact, I had this crazy job, and then I had to lie. They said because I had to get my diving's license, not free diving, but regular diving. And I wanted this job, so I had to sign away all these things. And like, do you have asthmatic? I'm like, no, of course not. At the time, I was taking a lot of steroids, and I went and did this whole diving thing. And yeah, it was just the asthma didn't improve, but I felt so relaxed not breathing. So that was kind of an interesting time.
I do have a question, or just to say something. It's very interesting that you started with safe, and you chose this scene from the baby shower. But I think the bathroom part is the one that really takes us, because it is almost mute. You don't listen to the women in the living room talking anymore, and then she's quiet there trying to grasp something from the image mirror. And it's very interesting because in the last meeting that we had here from the reading group, we were watching David Lynch, and David Lynch in one of the scenes from the third part of Twin Peaks, the one from 2017. There's a whole section of Audrey Horne, that is the character that is in a coma in the end of the second season, 25 years ago, and she doesn't appear during the third season. And then suddenly in episode, I don't know, 13, she appears. And she appears for 3 episodes. And what is happening there? We don't understand what's her place. I think it's a lot of metafiction in a way, because she's talking about soap opera. She's talking about Virginia Woolf. There's no narrative. But in the end, there is a song that is called the Audrey Horne song that she cannot avoid by dancing it. And then David Lynch decides to make a random scene out of this, that is her facing herself in the mirror, and she screams, and then that's the end of her presentation in the series. We don't understand what's the point of this character there, but I think it is this woman trying to grasp an image that she understands. We don't know if she is in a coma, if she recovered from the coma, but seeing safe again, and I told you that on emails, this word works so well for us here. Like what it is to work with the word safe, and how can we, for instance, deal with our lives in a safe way or in an unsafe way, and how can we watch films in a safe or unsafe way? I don't know. It's something that was coming here, and then in the end, there's this preservation of the unconscious that, in a way, the internet tries to break, and the pharmaceuticals too. So
yeah.
I don't know if you can talk a little bit about the unsafe and how preserving the unconscious maybe is preserving a little bit the unsafe.
No, I mean, it's very, the movie Safe, you know, is a movie about anxiety and the inability to locate yourself in the social. I mean, there's something very strong there about how can anyone see themselves as a woman, a sexual woman who wants to potentially have a baby in this horrifying scene of women, you know, and he puts them in those ridiculous pastel dresses. You know, you could never locate yourself in this. And so there's a collapse on the level of the image. I mean, very Dora-esque. But you don't have the feeling of the possibility of its transformation that you do when you read about Freud's hysterics, you know, with the hysterical elaboration and transformation of the question of what can I be in this world. It's as if it stays on the level of a question of the image and the body that's, you know, collapsing. And so this is the difference in Freud between what he called conversion hysteria and anxiety hysteria, or basically anxiety and hysteria. Have an unconscious on the side of anxiety, and hysteric is the person who has an unconscious. And to be hysterical and have an unconscious, I mean, I've been doing this forever, are synonymous in Freud. And for me, this is like the hinge point in the work. You know, and it's not to say that we don't, you know, we have to work with the transformation of anxiety into what's possible in terms of having an unconscious at this point. But I feel like the odds are really stacked against us. I mean, the internet is doing something very strange to our brains. Something's just now on the outside. You know, what can you have in any of the information or life that you're ingesting virtually? And then the world is driving anxiety. And, you know, the interesting question with pharma is the treatment of anxiety, depression, but also pain. I mean, all three of those in terms of the pharma that's we're all being slathered with, is that they're treating these three things. And psychoanalysis depends on not the sedation of pain, anxiety, or depression, but the transformation and the working of them through. I mean, this is so basic, I feel stupid saying it, but it's strange to me that it's all taking place around a question of breathing.
Yeah, Lacan is gonna have the concept of linguisterie, that is language and linguistics. It's not, so when he's gonna build the concept of the unconscious structured as language, he's going to say it's not about linguistics, it's about linguisterie. So you have to consider the lack, you have to remember the unconscious the whole time. And even when you're dealing with cinema and understanding cinema through psychoanalysis, and I don't know if understanding is a good word here, but dealing with theory and cinematic theory, remember the unconscious is trying to preserve something unknown, and the possibility of desiring with it. Yes.
I think that's why, I mean, the possibility of preserving an unknown, preserving the space of that, was why, you know, I mean, I don't think that Freud should have been so rude to his followers. He should have worked with them so that everyone didn't have to splinter off into ridiculous sects. The most egregious of which, by the way, was the way he treated Otto Rank. But nevertheless, I mean, he should have worked with them, you know, and I think he sort of just threw them out. He was like, oh, like, fine, go with your omnipotent fantasies. But part of what he was reacting to that I find legitimate, not his behavior, is the idea that you shouldn't, he wanted them to stop trying to know it all. You know, there's a portion of what could be understood. And he had this like, slow down, guys, come on, you know, we don't really understand this yet. And I mean, you see with Reich, who's the most interesting example, how megalomanic it gets. You know, and for somebody who did excellent work on questions of fascism, I mean, he was, you know, he is very important as a political psychoanalytic thinker. I mean, he was a monster to the people around him. It was monstrous.
Anyone has a question? Wants to say something?
And he ended up inventing like a giant gun. I mean, that's when the story ends.
How is it? Do you want to tell us about the gun?
Yeah, a gun that he attached, Stacy's right, that he attached radium to, that he was trying to use to like shoot down aliens that he imagined were in the sky. I mean, it was wild. It was his cloud busting gun. And Stacy and I found out that the cloud busting song by oh my God, why am I forgetting her name?
Katie Bush.
Kate Bush, yeah. That's about Wilhelm Reich. It's about she takes the perspective of his son watching his father being taken away by the FBI, and they used to go cloud busting together. And so it's I Still Dream of Organon and cloud busting, you know, like, so like it's the son like trying to remember his father and this beautiful memory of this like magical thing they did together that ended up his father's demise. He was taken away by the FBI, not just for the guns, but for the organ boxes, which he promised would cure cancer. So they sort of attacked him for medical malpractice. He thought that they were attacking him because he was a communist. And people said there's some validity to that, but it might actually be some like strange folie à deux. Like they thought there was another Wilhelm Reich who was a more active communist than Wilhelm Reich was, and they went after the wrong guy, but they decided to just go with it and get him. It's really sad. It's one of the saddest stories. We have great comments. I think Olivia Lang writes about this in Everybody.
And radium is not the name of the gun. It's the name of his operations with radium. No?
He would put a vial of radium beneath the gun that he saw it as dispersing it at the UFOs and into the clouds. I mean, he had this whole it really got crazy. There's actually very beautiful letters between him and Einstein. Einstein took him seriously. He knocked on Einstein's door, you know, in New Jersey. And Einstein said, okay, let's do experiments on your boxes and your theory. And then Einstein said, this isn't working. Like, it's not showing any increase in anything, any increase in temperature or any accumulation of energy. And, you know, Wilhelm Reich continued on his merry way. Kristen? I think you're still muted.
Sorry. Thank you so much. This is an amazing talk. And they're not really fully formed questions, but they're more sort of tangential or related moments in breathing that I'm wondering if you could speak to based on your work. One is, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking about the baby's first breath and the sort of inspiration that happens at that moment, and any thoughts you have to offer around that. And then the second one, as someone, I have long COVID and have asthma-like, but not asthmatic proper breathing issues. And this question of breathing for me has become very bound up with the question of phlegm, which is a little gross, but I'm just wondering, like, when there's a struggle with breathing, there's also almost always some sort of humidity or extra moisture in the body. And I'm wondering if any of the psychoanalysts you've mentioned explore that at all, right? That it's not simply about wind, that there's also something else happening physiologically and mentally, you know, reminds me of medieval body humor theory and that sort of thing. So those are two, take one, both, whatever. Thanks.
I mean, Fliess and Freud had a whole thing about phlegm. So the cycling of the nose was, you know, like people think of it as an HVAC system. So, you know, part of the problem that you can read in a book like James Nestor's book on breathing that everyone loves is, you know, basically we've become these like panting mouth breathers in contemporary civilization. Like our palates have fallen apart, our faces are deformed, we don't know how to breathe through our nose, so we can't clean our air anymore. We're like, our backs are breaking as we sit all day. We're like becoming these like disgusting creatures. And there's this desire to return to like, you know, the big jawed, like right nasal form, so that you don't have all this phlegm and this mouth breathing. The mouth breathing makes you too dry, but then it doesn't clear out the phlegm in the way that's necessary. So we're not balancing ourselves. The problem I see with this, you know, is that when you read a lot of these theories, it's like, let's go back to like, you know, I don't know, when we were like hunter-gatherers and we had the right bodies. Like, we're not going back. And the idea of this is disevolution, I'm not clear about. We, you know, part of the one of the blows to man's narcissism is that we are always in the middle of evolution. We will not see where this evolution that is running through our bodies is taking us. And this is horrible. I mean, someday, whatever is happening with our faces and our inability to breathe will become something. We'll either die or we will evolve, but we will never see it. We will have been these lame, mouth-breathing, phlegmed up creatures, and then we'll die. I mean, this is awful. And so I get worried about these books because they promise you, I don't know, they promise you a return to oneness. You know, and this is what I hear Freud reacting against is this. And, you know, him and Fliess, like Fliess also with his nose surgery, you know, saw the signs of phlegm as depression. And so he was going to clear out the nose and cure the depression. I mean, this is what's amazing when you go into the territory of breathing, is that we have been down this road over and over and over again. And I think the interesting question is like, where are we going? And a lot of what begins to interest me is the question of communication and language and poetry. And I know this sounds like ridiculous against this world of dysfunction and violence. Like, I'm going to hold up speaking and poetry. I haven't gone there yet in the writing, but kind of that's the direction I'm going, artistic creation and so on. And the first cry is wonderful. I mean, I really got taken with a Winnicottian idea, in fact, where he says there's the first inspiration and then the exhalation is the cry, right? I mean, it's like the child breathes in and then it's wah! And he believes that some kids don't get there to the real scream out. And the real scream out for him is when the child continues to be. It used to be in uterus, and then it had this passage, and then it needs to be again now on the outside. And something can get stuck there. And he says, you know, this is repeated again in asthma, but in many, many other symptoms. He believes that autoerotic asphyxiation is like still kind of being stuck there. He believes people who think that they can't, like, that they're lacking something in their bodies, which often can take the form of like, I can't get enough breath, is this failure to get past this, to kind of reclaim life. And he has the other example, which I think is very beautiful. It's very strange. He says that we get caught in cycles of reactive anger. Like, we don't know where it starts or ends. It's a reaction. And he says that this too is like the birth trauma. Like, you don't scream out like, fuck you, and then just get on with it. Like, that you're stuck constantly reacting to the traumatic situation that you can't get out of, and you don't know where it begins or ends. This was really interesting to me because Sloterdijk, in his book Terror from the Air, says that modern warfare, as the war on terror, is a war with no beginning or end and no sense of who started it. They always blame the other person. Right. And there's something like the idea of a war on terror, he says, is the misnomer of the century, because terrorism means it's not an end. So there is no end. There's no end to terror. And this he sees starting with the chlorine gas war moment in World War I, like bringing us to where we are now, basically. And there's something right about this, as if you're caught in a reaction that never gets to reset to zero. And, the reset to zero, to an extent, is what I think Freud says is, like having a neurotic unconscious. Anyway, so it's amazing to me that Winnicott starts from this first cry and he extrapolates all of this.
We have a question here from Ricky. Can you elaborate a bit on Freud's rejection on Rank's theory of the birth trauma and its relation to respiration?
Yeah, Freud said that, there's no representation at birth possible because birth is the beginning of representation. So to go back to this moment of the moment that psyche is leaning on soma, which Freud says he agrees with, that there's something of like a first somatic reaction in being born that psyche then develops out of. But to go back to that, he says he doesn't think clarifies the issues that Rank wanted clarified with respect to neurosis and treatment more generally. And he says something is still really obscure there that you have not clarified, and I just want to point that out. But unfortunately, I think some other issues came up, which is that Freud Freud at first said, this isn't a problem. We can talk about this. This isn't a problem. Like, you have your theory, we can talk about this. But the ranks started closing in around Rank, and they wanted to push him out. And I think it was because he really was Freud's beloved child. He was the only one of all the people, Jones, Abraham, whatever, all of the guys, Jung. He was the only one in Vienna. And we forget that he was 21 years old when he joined the psychoanalytic field. He was the youngest, he was the poorest, and he was the only one in Vienna. And Freud adopted him like a child. And he grew up with Anna Freud, actually. And so at this moment, there was friction. They drove a wedge between Freud and Rank. And Freud, unfortunately, fell prey to it, and quite viciously, because actually once Rank eventually emigrated to America, Freud wrote a letter to Brill and said, the guy's bipolar and is a menace to our field, and they threw him out of the American Psychoanalytic Association. So he joined the existentialists because he had nowhere else to go, poor guy. And so his influence was actually really important for the existential psychologists, who also are part of the whole Esalen world. So, Freud's like detritus created a whole field of therapies in the United States. But I found it really sad also because he was so poor, and he worked tirelessly for the Psychoanalytic Institution at the point that he wrote this book and was getting a little bit of money by giving lectures in the US and treating some US patient. Freud accused him of being fame and money hungry, that he was seduced by the American dollar, he wrote to him in a letter. And this is just mean.
Thank
Isn't
you.
that terrible, Ricky? Yeah.
Anyone has a question? We are beginning the end. But anyone wants to say something?
Could I ask a question?
Please.
Is that working? Yeah, I had a question and I will apologize actually because I missed the start, and so I'm sure this was covered in the start. If it was, I apologize. But can you talk more about the idea of the repression isn't functioning anymore, and that about the internet being the problem and not having this kind of unconscious relation? I guess I'm interested in this partially because I work in a lot of illness memoir, and I'm interested in this move away from this sort of idea of recognition where, we think of this stigmatized person as just having no depth, having no interiority, but actually here you get to see their full humanity, towards this more kind of focus on opacity, focus on surfaces, I would say, as a recent move away from an idea of letting you recognize someone else into something more arguably more political, arguably more critical, but yeah, fundamentally kind of has a different goal, which I'm kind of calling relates like flatness. So I'm curious, yeah, about your point regarding repression and having no unconscious, or the internet being the problem.
I mean, for me, it's not a pathologization of anxiety. It's to say that we all need more repression at this point. I mean, I'm more anxious and have less dreams and like less constructed symptoms because I look at my phone 6 hours a day or some ungodly thing. And so, I mean, it's not to say there's those people and their surface flatness and there's us with our great depth unconscious, but to say that we're always moving between these. And I think we're at a point of maximum anxiety, maximum somatic issues, and less the kind of constructed narratives that appear through one's symptoms in a life. And you know, I'm blaming the internet. I feel like the internet's getting blamed for everything, and I'm not that comfortable with it. But there is something for me, which is that it's putting us on the outside of ourselves. And I'm not, you know, I'm not like I'm very much a Heideggerian who doesn't believe that like everything's in your head. For me, it's a Lacanian question of a Mobius of you know navigating internal and external, but one has to either find a place on the outside or take the outside in a way that gives it a place, right? I mean, this is the process, and I think that we're having real difficulty doing this. I think in the future one will, you know, again, the evolution that will outlive us. But at this very moment, there's something about you know, and I'm playing a little bit with the Lacanian idea of the, you know, the return from the real, like a kind of social foreclosure. I'm not a Malarian who thinks that everyone's psychotic, but a kind of social foreclosure that's putting the question of the threat to breath on the outside. Too much on the outside. And one of the things that I would say about breathing, like a lot of the techniques, a lot of the very classical Eastern techniques are about making you pay attention to your breathing and to slow it, right? Like you were talking about your deep diving. I mean, that's like an incredible slowing of breath. It's to put time back in relationship to one's breathing. And, you know, we don't take this time anymore because of the internet and because of the way that life has become so rapid. You know, we're already like the things that you used to do as a child before you even understood them, like the kind of après coup life of the child where a whole number of things happen and then something comes that makes them make sense, that like pushes it away and then you get to start over again. I'm rarely having that experience anymore because of the sheer speed with which we are navigating information and virtually dealing with life. And, you know, it's interesting that, you know, everyone's doing mindfulness techniques at this point. But I mean, the very basic thing about mindful techniques is that it's trying to bring time back in. But for me, the greater unconscious transformation may or may not happen in that respect. But, you know, I would err on the side of no, because I think we need more than just that. More than just that. But we might be at a point where society's gonna just collapse our bodies. I mean, I have to believe that at this point. I mean, we'll bomb the shit out of bodies and we don't care, and we'll let everyone's nervous system and physiological system collapse. Nobody cares. And you know, that's the scary part about this study for me.
I think exhaling, not only thinking about breathing in but breathing out, it's a very important highlight in here, because it is about exhaling, so you can try to find a form to recuperate some way of reforming the way how to breathe. So exhaling has to do with this, and talking is exhaling pretty much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the
Anyone
beginning, it's the
Go, go.
beginning object, right? I mean, it's the beginning object, petit a. It's the first, it's the most minimal object in a way, which Lacan also said about the voice. It's the object with the least props.
And it's about being human, staying, living on Earth, and having to do with gravity. From seminar 20, isn't it? That he's going to say that you have to really see about the laws of Newton, because his laws are talking about the losses, and the losses is pretty much talking about object A, and what you build after one losing, that is the object A that you don't have anymore, or you're trying to find the whole time.
Yeah.
And how you voice after it. Anyone has the last question, a final question here? Before
If I may,
please, go ahead.
Something that got a lot my attention of what you share with us is when you described asthma in terms of the failure to exhale. And this reminded me my experiencing my mom died because it was a natural death, and I saw clearly how she exhaled and there was no more intake, right? So I was wondering whether this failure to exhale that now we have in our societies at the same time a failure to accept death, right? We just can't see death anymore in this more organic, natural way. I'm not talking about this failure of not caring for the collapse of our bodies as we are witnessing now with the war and with COVID, but this other sense of allowing us to learn how to die, to accept death in this other way that would avoid us to avoid by any means to these technologies of extending our lives and these dreams of uploading our bodies to become immortal in the technological sense. So at the same time that we are not caring about the death of others, there is this very impossibility, this failure to accept death, right? So I wonder if you have some thoughts about it. Thank you.
No, I would just say that's a nice place to end. I mean, absolutely. I think it's it's like first breath to the last. There's something about acknowledging that, there's like the numbers. You will have breathed X number of times in your lifetime, and they give you the number, the average number. It's you could do the same thing with days, with time, but it's really that you could kind of give a sense of a life. One more internal, one more external. Breath on the inside, time on the outside. Lucas, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I was thinking. I was saying thank you, and thank you all for being here today. We recorded, and we are gonna upload in the YouTube so we can see it again. I think it was a very important discussion. I think the end with learning how to die is also beautiful. Yeah. And thank you again, Jameson, for accepting this invitation. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Ciao.
Ciao. Everyone listen to Kate Bush.
Yes. And it's a beautiful video clip too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really great. Yes. Thank you, Lucas. I'll see you soon, I hope.
You, Jameson. Yes.
Send me more things.
Okay, of course.
Okay, good. Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.